My name is Ann Connors. I am part of the admissions team. I'm sure I've met many of you during this time that we have been virtual. If you are new, welcome to our Faculty Spotlight series. We are wrapping up the series tomorrow for 2020, and we will kick off again in January. So without further ado, I know we still have a couple people joining us. I just want to let you know who's on the call today. Besides myself from admissions, I'm joined by Karen Cunningham and Catherine Hayes, who will be on the back end answering any questions you may have. If you have technical difficulties, just send us a chat. We are also welcomed by Emma Caldwell from the Sustainability Certificate, and of course, Senior Lecturer Jason Jay, who will kick it off with our programming today. So without further ado, Jason, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, and for all of you joining from around the world. Really appreciate your being here and your interest in MIT Sloan. Given that we're getting close to the holidays, I thought I would actually start with just like some pictures of my kids, right? Why not? This is a picture of some pictures of my family. This is my wife and I. These are my in-laws, our son Vikram when he was a baby. These are our two kids, Vikram and Uma. This is a more recent photograph of them. As you can see, we are a global family. I grew up in Boulder, Colorado, and my wife grew up in Kolkata, India. This past year, this is what Calcutta looked like during the cyclone Amphan. Loss of life, loss of property, loss of economy. And this is what Boulder, Colorado, where I grew up, looked like. The Calwood fire burned down the environmental education facility where I first learned to start thinking about what's going on our planet. You know, moments like this, events like this, they touch us. They move us. They mobilize us. And they might even get us out into the streets. September 2019 was actually the largest global mobilization and action around climate change. 4 million people hit the streets, more than twice as big as any previous climate action. And despite what I just said about being someone who's moved by, who cares about, who wants to work on climate change, that morning I was kind of dragging my heels. I had a lot to do, a lot in my inbox to go marching around. But I saw images like this one from London, from Australia, from Germany, from the time zones that were ahead of me that morning. And I said, we've got to do something. I've got to do something to support the next generation. So I went to my son, Vikram. He was 9 years old at the time. He was just opening his eyes for a day at school. And I said, I'm going to this climate march today. It's going to be hot and there's going to be a lot of people. It's going to be crowded. There's going to be a lot of walking. But if you want to join, you can. And he opened his eyes and he sat up and he said, Dad, what do you think? And this is a picture of a sign he made in a MIT classroom with a bunch of grad students. This is us with a few thousand of our friends in Boston City Hall. And this is our Sustainability Initiative team. And it reflects what's happening right now, which is that we are globally getting animated around an issue that we see as an existential threat, and as a source of new possibilities, new ways of running our economy and society that might allow humans and other life to flourish for generations to come. And we can get swept up in it. We can feel a sense of momentum around this. This is what that momentum looks like in civil society, of people just getting out into the streets. But that's not the only sphere in which we see this kind of momentum. We see momentum on the public policy stage. So, more than 180 countries got together to sign the Paris Accords and to agree to a global goal to reduce global warming to 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, ideally 1.5. And the US federal government left the Paris Accord under the Trump administration. But even when that happened, a coalition of cities and states and towns and cultural institutions and businesses and investors said, we are still in. We are still in the Paris Accord. We're still committed to these goals. We're still committed to solving these global challenges. And now, with hope, the US will come back to the table. So there is momentum at the institutional level, at the policy level. There is momentum at the business level. So if we look at companies and what corporations are doing, there are big goals being set. More than 276 companies now are part of the RE100, committing to power their operations with 100% renewable energy, or to purchase renewable energy equivalent to their operations. The Science-Based Targets Initiative, the SBTI, more than 1,000 companies have joined the Science-Based Targets Initiative to set targets to have their company's emissions fall in line with what the scientists tell us that our global economy has to achieve. And more than 360 companies have committed at a level that is equivalent to what we all need to do to get to 1.5 degrees. And companies are working in tandem with the investor community, with the capital markets. There's momentum and this process of building in the capital markets. So the Climate Action 100 is a recognition that there's about 100 companies that represent 2/3 of global emissions. And so 350 investors with $34 trillion in assets under management have promised to engage, to use their shareholder power to drive companies to take those emissions seriously. So they're engaging with the 100 companies that are the 2/3 of global industrial emissions, and then another 60 companies that could play a critical role in a clean energy transition. And then using that power to drive in those companies better governance of climate issues, decarbonization of their value chains, and disclosure of what they're doing following the protocol of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or the TCFD. There's a Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance. So the big heavy-hitting investors, 33 institutional investors with $5 trillion of assets under management, have committed to investment portfolios that are net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And that includes pension funds like CalPERS, insurance companies like Munich Re, sovereign wealth funds like Caisse de Dépôt in France, high net worth family offices and foundations like the Rockefeller Fund, and asset managers of various kinds that are looking to help these players like Allianz. So what you can think of this as, like, all of us are sort of mobilizing to take this problem seriously and to set goals that are in line with what it is that we need to accomplish. But we've got 3 problems. So the first problem is that the scale of this action and the magnitude of this action is really quite incredible, of what would be required to fulfill on essentially the promises that are being made. If we look at the trajectory of global greenhouse gas emissions, right now our business as usual scenario is taking us close to 100 gigatons of CO2 being emitted every year in 2100. And that's a future that the science suggests will be 3.6 degrees warmer in Celsius terms than we were in pre-industrial levels. I also report these numbers in Fahrenheit for those Americans among us who are Celsius challenged. And the goal of the Paris Accord is to get to a 2-degree future, ideally to a 1.5 degree future, which means this dramatic reduction in global greenhouse gas emissions. And that is an incredible gap. And it's a gap that is really, really important to solve, because what does 3.6 degrees of warming mean? Well, already we have warmed the planet about 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels. We've already warmed the planet 1 degree. So you can see this 1 degree line here. And therefore, we're seeing those pictures that I showed earlier of our hometowns of Calcutta and Boulder, of wildfire damage, of food supply instabilities, of soil erosion, water scarcity, a whole suite of things, storm intensity and frequency, like the cyclone I mentioned, all of which we're already seeing at 1 degrees. And our business as usual future takes us to 3.6 degrees Celsius, into a zone where those risks go from being detectable to being very high risks of severe irreversible impacts with limited ability to adapt. This comes from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which is the main scientific body around climate. So that's the first problem. The first problem is that this is a big, important problem to solve, and it's really hard. There's a big gap between our business as usual and where we want to be. The second problem is that all of those goals, all of that momentum I described, the countries setting targets, the investors setting targets, the companies setting targets, all of us in civil society setting targets, those are great. Like they're saying, we want to follow the science. But does action meet the level of those targets? So just as one simple example, the Paris Accord. The Paris Accord said our goal is 2 degrees. And then each country made nationally determined contributions, intended nationally determined contributions, INDCs. And if you add up the emissions reduction that would come from those INDCs, the actions that countries were really prepared to take, they added up to a future with reduced emissions, but not enough. Only 3.3 degrees Celsius. So when the people are getting out into the streets, what they're saying is, let's get real. Let's get real about the magnitude of what's involved here. And let's have a plan of action. Let's get strategic. Let's really understand not just what you hope your successor does by 2050, but what we can do now. So the first problem is the magnitude. The second problem is our actions don't necessarily match with our commitments. And then we have a third problem when we want to engage and educate people like you on this webinar around this whole theme of climate change. And that third problem has been articulated by my colleague John Sturman as the following. Research shows that showing people research doesn't work. So what that means is I could stand here and show you PowerPoint slide after PowerPoint slide, photograph after photograph, graph after graph, and you would change nothing about your actions. Even your understanding of the climate system really wouldn't improve all that much. It would improve somewhat, but not at the level of insight and understanding that all of us need if we're going to play a role in this big global transition. So instead, what we're going to do is attempt an interactive workshop here. Now, I just got an email right before this that 1,100 people had signed up for this webinar. I don't know how many of them are actually online at this very moment, but so how do I do interactivity with 1,100 people? I'm not going to ask you to put your comments in the chat. Okay, I just got a note from my colleague that we have 610 people on the call. So what we're going to do is I'm going to use a little technology here, and we're going to make use of a tool called Poll Everywhere. And the way Poll Everywhere works is that I pose a question, and you type in an answer. And the way that you type in that answer is through a special website where I am putting the link into the chat right now. .com/btgbook. And when I give you this link, what's going to happen is that your answers to the questions I pose are going to show up on the screen for all of us to see. And they're going to be anonymous. It's not going to be attached to your name or your IP address or your cell phone number or anything like that. But it'll just allow us to get kind of rapid fire input from this large number of people that we have on the screen. So what you need to do is, in order for this to work, is you've got the Zoom going where you're going to see me. And then in parallel, I want you to open a web browser tab. I actually recommend doing this on a phone because just because it's like a separate device, it won't get in the way unless you have multiple screens. And then what's going to happen is that I'm going to ask multiple questions over the course of our time together, and you just keep that web page open. So whatever tab you've got open, either on your phone or your computer with this pollev.com/btgbook, you just keep that open, and it will, and whatever question I pose will show up live on your phone, on your screen, and then whatever answer you put will percolate up here onto the screen. And right now, I'm using a word cloud display. And the way a word cloud display works is that the words get larger if multiple people will respond that way. So we've got a nice contingent here from Boston. We've got a nice contingent from New York, Chicago, Houston, London. But I love the global reach of this kind of conversation because we've got Mumbai, Jakarta, Bogota, Ankara, Dubai, Accra, Pune, Rome, Miami. So fantastic. And this is what's great about this is that this is exactly who we need at the table if we want to solve this kind of big global challenge. One little technical thing I'll point out about Poll Everywhere that you'll notice is that, again, because I'm trying to incorporate data from right now 467 people, I have to use this word cloud. And the way the word cloud is that if you answer a question with 2 words, it will break up your words and they won't display together. So for example, that's why we have new as one word here and York as the other word. If what you need to answer is 2 words like that, you write new hyphen York. The way that the person wrote Tel dash Aviv, I saw Tel Aviv with a hyphen in it, and or maybe I did it a minute ago. So that's the way to do this. So another in the future I'll say like one word or hyphenated phrase. What I mean is try to be succinct, try to have it be 1 or 2 words, but if it needs to be 2 words, use a hyphen. Okay, so this was just sort of a test poll to get a sense of who we have in the room. So now what are we going to do with this, how are we going to do this interactively? How are we going to explore this climate challenge? Well, what we're going to do is that we are going to use a couple of tools that have been developed here at the MIT Sloan School in collaboration with our partners at an organization called Climate Interactive that is staffed by our largely with MIT alumni. These tools are C-ROADS and N-ROADS, which they stand for Climate Rapid Overview and Decision Support Tool, and En-ROADS. These are tools that have been developed. They're based on system dynamics modeling of the energy and climate system that goes back 40 years, that have been gradually accumulating insights about how these systems work, but then calibrated with the most recent, freshly available data. In fact, we just refreshed the tool this past week with updated data that interestingly changed our sort of view of the world. But these are tools that are free and accessible to all with a web browser. Any of you can open these up and start playing with them. I'm not going to ask you to do that right here on this call, but that is something I'm going to suggest you do afterwards, just so that we can keep our attention focused together. They are transparent. So all the equations, one of these tools has more than 14,000 equations underneath the hood. All the equations and structure are available in the reference guides. These are calibrated and tested against integrated assessment models. So those are big supercomputer models that can tell you about the impacts of the climate in particular places around the world and that take weeks to run and to try out different scenarios. But our tool runs instantly in an ordinary web browser on an ordinary computer. And the reason it's able to do that is because these models are highly aggregated. So they're looking at the whole dynamics of the world all at once, rather than trying to compute it separately for every single sub-geography or sector. And so what that's going to allow us to do is to have a dynamic, interactive, conversation. We'll use it in quotes because there are 600 of us about what's going on in the climate system. And this is very important. The ability to have tools that allow this kind of rapid exploration is very important because it allows us to have conversations. And some of you may know that I wrote a book called Breaking Through Gridlock, The Power of Conversation in a Polarized World. I think conversation is fundamental to our ability to build the coalitions and to get the action that's necessary. And so this is a tool for conversation. It has been a tool for conversation with more than 100 elected officials. We're close to 40 senators in the US Senate, more than 100 members of the House, business leaders, C-suite leaders, board level leaders from a whole variety of different sectors and industries. This is a photograph of one of my favorite workshops I got to do. It's in the largest bamboo structure in the world off the coast of, off the side of Bali. We had 120 cross-sectoral leaders from Indonesia. I did this workshop on a Tuesday. On Wednesday, I trained a subset of the people to be facilitators themselves. On Thursday, they translated the materials into Bahasa Indonesian, and on Friday, they ran it with another group of political leaders in Jakarta. So this thing is going viral as and in the good way, not the COVID way. And we're really excited about the impact that we're starting to have. We're getting written endorsements from Republicans and Democrats here in the United States and people around the world who are engaging with this tool. And this is exactly the same tool that the tools that we're gonna get to experience and play with today on this webinar. So coming back to where we were, which is the Paris Accord and this global agreement to limit emissions, to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius, or ideally 1.5. Now, the national plans that were made under Paris are not enough to get us there. Since then, some other things have happened, some other commitments have come in, which everybody's sort of trying to understand what they mean, how serious they are. But I'm just going to pose a question to you, which is, if we think about this in the global context, all those countries that you are coming from, what country do you personally most hope takes action on climate change? So what I'm doing here is I'm moving on to the next poll. So you keep that tab open, that same browser tab on your computer or your phone, and then it's going to pose this new question: what country do you most hope takes action on climate change? And again, the font size here reflects the frequency with which an answer is coming through the poll. So I'm watching the numbers spin up here. We've got more than 300 respondents. And not surprisingly, the big ones here are China and the United States. Okay, many of us know that China is now the largest total emitter in the world, and the U.S. is the highest emitter in terms of emissions per capita. So our emissions intensity of the U.S. is very high, and so anything that's achieved. In fact, the Paris Accord came together at the start because of a U.S.-China bilateral agreement that John Kerry and Ernie Moniz helped to broker, which then led to the larger thing. But USA and China are not the only countries on here. India comes in probably third, and then you're all naming countries that you are personally connected to, from Indonesia, Guatemala, Brazil, Denmark, Mongolia, Ghana, Netherlands, Sweden, Nigeria, Vanuatu, Beijing. All of them have some kind of role to play. Well, so the question is, what role do they have to play? And C-Roads, which is our first tool that we're going to play with, is designed to explore this question. So let's start with the USA, and let's start with the USA, since that seems to be in the biggest font size here and is therefore the one that we'll start with. This is C-Roads. This gives us a picture about global emissions. So on the y-axis here, we have gigatons of CO2 per year. And this is looking at carbon dioxide. Of course, there are other greenhouse gases, which I'll talk about later: methane, nitrous oxide, sulfur hexafluoride, etc. This is essentially just looking at the CO2 emissions from energy on this particular graph. We can look at other graphs that, so for example, this is CO2 equivalent per year, which is where you take the methane and the nitrous oxide, which are much stronger greenhouse gases, and you calibrate them so that you are counting them as if they were in CO2 equivalents. So, but the idea here is that, again, our business as usual scenario is that our greenhouse gas emissions are increasing, our temperature is therefore increasing, and we're blowing past that 1.5 degree target in about 2036, and we're blowing past the 2 degree target in about 2054. So just to think about that, that's the year where my son is exactly the age that I am right now. I'm 43 years old, my son is 10. 2053, when we blow past the 2 degree target, is when he's my age. And with all the associated risks with that. So now if we look at, so what we see here is the default curve, and this is based on our best understanding of kind of the global climate system. So underneath the hood, this is modeling all the basic physical dynamics of the climate, as well as the energy system and the greenhouse gas emissions that come from the energy system. So, so you guys all said, I want the USA to take action. Absolutely. So USA is this red line here. What you can see is that we show the emissions kind of declining a little bit, but sort of staying roughly level, roughly the same with like some slight increases. So let's say that the US got really serious about climate change. And we said, you know what, Biden's coming in. We are done increasing our emissions. And in fact, we're going to start in 2021, we're going to start a aggressive plan of decarbonization. And so, normally if we were in a room, I'd ask people to shout out how fast we should reduce. I'm not going to do another poll for this, but let's say that we get very ambitious and we reduce our emissions at 5% per year. And so that leads to us essentially eliminating the emissions of the United States, decarbonizing the US economy a little after mid-century. If we want to be even more aggressive, let's say we want to do like an 8% reduction rate, you'll see that those emissions will fall a little more rapidly. And as a result, we've just changed the world. We've just taken our future temperature increase from 3.6 degrees under the baseline scenario to a 3.4 degree scenario, which is what's drawn here on the bottom. Now, for some of you, that's a bigger change than you thought it was going to be, because you answered the question, this is all about China and India. For some of you, this is a much smaller change than you thought it would be. You thought, gosh, the US is such a big emitter. I'm trying to imagine decarbonizing the US economy, and this is what we can achieve. I'd love to have seen that graph fall a lot more. But this is the nature of the challenge, is that it is a global challenge. We reduce all the emissions from the United States. Let's say that, for example, we were to shut down all of our coal plants and convert everything to renewable energy. That's kind of the trajectory we could be on, and this is what it means to get to net zero, and this is the impact of the US. Now some of you are saying, yeah, see, I told you it was about China and India. So great, let's look at that. So China, in our baseline scenario here, we have them sort of peaking emissions by about 2080. Now, what you may know is that recently, Premier Xi Jinping made a new assertion about the Chinese climate trajectory. He said that their target is now that in 2030 they will peak their emissions, and by 2060 they will get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions in China. So again, with all the caveats about what does it mean, what do those commitments mean, how likely are they to be achieved, let's explore what that looks like. So if China were to peak its emissions in 2030, and then we're not going to say, and start reducing their emissions right at that time, 2030, and reducing it fast enough such that by 2060, this graph would get down to net zero emissions. That's roughly a 10% annual reduction in emissions. So now we've got a situation where China is reaching very close to net zero emissions in 2060. And now what we've done is that's had a very big effect. So we went from a 3.4 degree scenario to a 2.9 degree scenario. So that's 0.5 degrees of temperature change that could occur if China is able to fulfill that commitment. And now together, the US and China have sort of gotten us an important part of the way. So if we look at our poll here of what you guys thought was significant, clearly those are big players. They're very significant. Now, there's a number of other countries here that are mentioned, like the Netherlands and Canada and Sweden and Denmark and Germany and Israel and Japan. These are all other developed countries that are in kind of a similar position to the United States. So with US leadership, with American technology or technologies that we adopt from China, Taiwan, Norway, et cetera, then maybe other developed countries can also come on board and follow a similar trajectory to what the United States does. So let's see what happens if they also do something like an 8%, or maybe they follow China's level of ambition and do a 10% reduction rate as they're decarbonizing. That's going to be worth another 0.2 of a degree. And sorry, that was other developed countries. Let me get the EU in here, which we've broken out as a separate block. And so now we've got the entire developed world decarbonized, and we've got China achieving its commitment. And so now we're at 2.6 degrees. 2.6 degrees is a much safer world. It is not a safe world. So just, to remind ourselves what this picture looks like is that 2.6 degrees is still taking us deep into the red zone of like very high climate risks. So we need to do a little bit more. We need to do a lot more. And what you start to notice is that there's still these growth of emissions in developing countries. And you recognize that. So India is in a pretty big font here. That was sort of the number 3 in terms of what countries you all suggested. And so what happens if India follows suit? So let's say that India is able to do what China does and follow a 2030 to peaking and reductions trajectory along a similar level of ambition to China. That gets us to 2.4 degrees. And we're still blowing past these targets. Now, again, much safer world, but we're still running the risk of runaway climate change in a variety of different ways. So then the final truth of what's reflected in your comments here, which is we gotta think about Nigeria. We have to think about Indonesia. We have to think about Colombia, Ghana. These are countries who are growing their economies rapidly. And so the question is, can they decarbonize? Can we grow, can they leapfrog in the same way that they leapfrogged past landline telephony to mobile telephony? Can they leapfrog over fossil fuel development to low carbon energy development? And that's what would be reflected in something like in something, and maybe it takes them longer. Maybe there's more growth of industrial economy so that they're peaking in 2050, and then beginning a decline in 2050 that's even a bit more modest. That gets us below 2 degrees. So this is the rationale for why this is such an all hands on deck conversation, and why it needs to be a global conversation, and why it's so exciting to have a global community like MIT Sloan thinking about this very intensively. Okay, so the exercise here was intended to kind of explore that first problem. How big is this challenge? And you can start to see the level of ambition necessary to be able to get us onto the right trajectory. It also deals a little bit with the second thing, which is, okay, we make commitments, but do we really know how to achieve them? And so we can see just how important it is to hold ourselves accountable for achieving these climate goals, whatever they may be. But there's another question which I really have not addressed at all, which is how? How are you doing this? Okay, so you say China's going to reduce its emissions by 10% every year, but what does that actually look like? What are the policies? What are the technologies? What are the investment strategies? What are the business strategies that might actually get us to that place? So that's the next question we have to ask ourselves. And so I'll put this out as the next poll. This one is going to be a little bit challenging to get into these one-word answers. If you can do one-word answers, that's great. If it needs to be a couple of a hyphenated phrase, that's also good. So we're going to see a whole array of cool climate solutions percolating up here. I'm just going to change the color scheme here because I don't like, let's see, can I actually fix that? No. Okay, so we're not gonna be able to use font size or font color to help us. We're gonna have to just use font size, which is fine. Okay, but this is fantastic. So we've got a huge array of possible climate solutions that people are suggesting. Carbon tax, reduced consumption, renewable energy, renewables, nuclear energy, behavioral shifts, plant-based foods, ocean preservation, carbon sequestration, supply chain sustainability, technology sharing worldwide, circular economy, Pigouvian tax, vegetarian living, sustainable mobility. So this is great. So this is clearly an audience that has been thinking about this. All of us are part of this global conversation. And there's a few things here that that are coming up a lot. So now the question is, well, how do we think about these? You know, if I'm a politician, this is something that we've learned going and engaging with senators and governors and congresspeople and people in presidential administrations, is that when they or even city mayors or your own town councilor, they look at this menu and they say, okay, um, all of these sound like reasonably good ideas. Sorry, I'm trying to make this a little bit bigger for you to be able to see on your screens. Um, let me see if I can. Well, actually, let me see if I pull this off of full screen and then make it full screen again. Okay, that is what it is. So what for a decision maker like that, all of these sound about the same. If you come to them saying, hey, we need to provide a tax subsidy for renewable energy, and then somebody else comes and says, hey, we need a carbon tax, and somebody else says, hey, we need to get people eating more vegetarian food, we need to make our infrastructure more smart, we need to electrify our vehicles, Teslas for everybody, it all basically sounds the same. Because this is my mental bandwidth for thinking about all of the issues that I have to worry about. Okay? This is COVID-19. This is getting the economy back on track. This is all of the environmental issues. This is climate change. And now, with that amount of mental bandwidth that I have to sort of take all this in. It all sounds the same. So, how do we understand the relationships between these different approaches? How do we evaluate them and understand how strong they are, how much potential they have to help us achieve these really critical and important goals? Well, that's why we invented En-ROADS. So the En-ROADS tool is the next tool that we're going to start playing with. En-ROADS is the Energy Rapid Overview and Decision Support tool. So initially we were developing it to think about the energy system. But increasingly, what we've done is add more. So it really is a kind of climate solutions scenario. There's a lot of land and agriculture and other options here that are incorporated in this tool. So on the bottom here, we've got a whole variety of different levers to pull. These are things that governments can do, investors can do, companies can do, citizens can do to try to tackle climate change. I can pull these and I can change in real time what's going on. This is the, underneath the hood, this is a globally aggregated model of sort of the techno-economic system and how it interacts with the climate system. This graph shows us how much energy we're generating from coal, oil, natural gas, renewable energy, which includes wind, solar, and geothermal, and hydro energy. This magenta color is bioenergy, biofuels, and then there's a sliver of nuclear energy across the top here in this light teal. On the right graph here, we can see the temperature change, which we were looking at before, and seeing that we're going well past our 1.5 and 2 degree targets, and with a final temperature in 2100 of 3.6 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels. I'm going to change this right side graph to one that's a little bit more action oriented and will help us understand things better. These are the greenhouse gas emissions by gas. So how much of the global warming is being caused by land use change, the green band, so things like deforestation. How much is through CO2 burned and emitted by fossil fuels, which is this gray band. This orange color is F gases, which are fluorinated gases like sulfur hexafluoride. And then CH4, which is methane, and N2O, which is nitrous oxide, which are about 30 to 50 times stronger than CO2, methane is, and nitrous oxide is more than 100 times stronger than CO2. They don't last as long in the atmosphere. We model that independently, but here we can sort of stack them up into CO2 equivalents. So this is our picture where we're going to explore the consequences of our decisions. And we can explore those consequences in a whole variety of ways. So not just energy and greenhouse gases, but we can look at financial impacts on, how much money are we spending on energy, or how much are we spending on taxes and subsidies relative to a base case here. So let's try some of the things that you all suggested. So in the poll here, the biggest font size here that I can in my screen is renewables. Especially when I look at renewable energy and renewable are all on here separately as sort of big potential solutions. So let's look at renewable energy. Renewable energy we can encourage by pulling this little slider right here. Before I do that, I'm going to teach you a little mental habit that's going to maximize your learning from the use of this tool. And that is to think like a scientist. A scientist forms a hypothesis, then they gather data, and then they look at how that data matches with their hypothesis and whether it confirms or disconfirms it. And then that difference between what you expect and what you see is the learning. Okay? So I want you to form an expectation. When I pull this lever of renewable energy, which means I'm going to subsidize renewable energy all around the world, I'm going to use tax credits, renewable portfolio standards, corporate renewable energy targets, investor renewable energy targets. We're going to encourage renewable energy. What are we going to see happen on this graph here? How is this going to change? And then what are we going to see on this graph about greenhouse gas emissions? And then what is that going to do to temperature? What kind of future are we going to be living into? If I go from a status quo to a pretty substantial global subsidy on renewable energy. Okay, you form that mental opinion, make your guess, and here we go. Okay, so I've just subsidized renewable energy. If I go into the details here, it's equivalent to a 2 cent per kilowatt hour subsidy, ramping up pretty immediately. You can see that renewable energy demand has grown relative to the baseline. I can kind of rewind that change and you can see the delta. So you can see this green band of renewable energy is expanding as a result of the economics becoming more favorable. And as a result, you can see the bottom part of this is shrinking a little bit. So people are using a little bit less natural gas and coal to produce electricity. And as a result of that, we can see that this gray band of greenhouse gas emissions from energy is decreasing. And as a result of that, we've gotten ourselves about 1/10 of a degree of improvement in warming. Okay, now if we're in person, I would say raise your hand if that was a smaller change than you thought it was going to be. Raise your hand if that was okay, all right, oh, this is cool. I actually can see your Zoom raised hands. I don't know if I can get a total count. Oh yeah, I think I can see. Let's see if I can get a total count of those. If I click my participants window here, that may be possible. All right, so now you can put your hands. Everyone who's just raise your hand. You can put your hands down. So 160 people have said that was a smaller change than you thought it was going to be. Okay, now I want you to raise your hand if that was a bigger change than you thought it was going to be. Okay, I can see the hands are coming in a little bit more slowly right now. We'll get a final count in just a second from my colleagues here. This is cool. So it looks like 49 of you think that this was so about 3 to 4 times as many of you thought this was a smaller change than you anticipated, and that makes sense. So then the question is, well, why? What's going on here? Why is it that when we subsidize renewable energy, we get all this new wind and solar just got built? Why didn't that solve the problem? And to understand this, we need to think about the dynamics of the system. System dynamics is the discipline of modeling complex systems using sets of differential equations, or just even visually depicting systems through stocks and flows and feedback loops. It's something that was invented at MIT Sloan by Jay Forrester, further advanced by John Sturman, who's the head of the System Dynamics Department and the faculty director for the Sustainability Initiative, and it's the basis of what we're doing here. One of the basic concepts in system dynamics is the idea of the stock and flow. The stock and flow. So stock and flow, we can always think about using the metaphor of a bathtub. So if you've ever taken a bath, which hopefully you have, a bathtub is the amount of water in a bathtub is the stock. And I'll show you what this looks like for the stock of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. All right, so here's kind of the key thing that we need to understand. So a stock and flow we depict this way. We put this box around a stock, and then there's the inflow, which is like the faucet pouring water into the tub. And then there's an outflow, a drain, which is like the drain pulling water out of the tub. So the central challenge that we're all trying to deal with here is the fact that we're turning on the faucet more and more and more every year, pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. They're accumulating because the planet cannot absorb them as fast as we're emitting. And so the level of greenhouse gases is increasing in the atmosphere. And as a result, it is forming kind of a blanket around the planet, which is causing us to get warmer and warmer and change our weather patterns. So I moved through that very quickly. I'm happy to come back to that later if we need to. But the key insight here about renewables is that the stock of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is not the only stock and flow dynamic that we're dealing with. The other one is, in addition to this atmospheric concentration stock with our emissions and removal, is the stock of our infrastructure. So when we build a new plant, a new facility, a new power plant, that is construction. We are adding to that stock of capital, of physical capital. And over time, we retire that capital. So we retire a plant when it becomes defunct, or sometimes when it prematurely explodes, which unfortunately does happen sometimes with our oil infrastructure. But the idea here is that it takes time for the stock to turn over. And in fact, the turnover time for the stock of power generation equipment is roughly 40 years. So what that means is that in our scenario here that we're working on together, we subsidize renewable energy. And so we caused more stuff to get built. We caused the construction of new renewable energy, adding to the stock of our total energy generation physical capacity. But we didn't deal with the outflow, because the thing is that all of that renewable energy was piling in on top of a pre-existing fossil fuel infrastructure. So we still had our coal plants and our gas plants and our oil refineries and extraction and production facilities all operating and running and emitting, and therefore we didn't really reduce greenhouse gas emissions because we didn't do anything that would shut down those emissions. So very long-winded way of exploring this first idea. Now, it doesn't mean that renewables are a bad idea. This is all stuff that is low carbon energy. It's not polluting. One of the reasons, interestingly, one of the other reasons why we only saw a 1/10 of a degree difference with this subsidy is that renewables are already becoming very price competitive. They're already scaling very rapidly. You can see that renewables are already a pretty substantial part of the energy mix of the future. And we're giving it a boost, but it's not enough to pull off some of these. It's not enough to substitute away some of those emitting infrastructures. So now let's go to another concept here in your actions to solve climate change. So another one here is carbon tax. That's the other one that's in kind of the biggest, boldest letters. And it's not the only one actually that says carbon tax. Someone says incentives. Someone said Pigouvian tax. So for those of you who may or may not have taken economics in recent times, the idea of a carbon tax or a carbon price is that when I go out and I drive my car and I push greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, it doesn't cost me anything to put CO2 in the atmosphere. If I'm running a big power plant, it doesn't cost me anything to put CO2 in the atmosphere. But it does cost other people, because those emissions add up to warming the planet, and that warming planet creates all kinds of economic costs on our infrastructure, on our lives, on our livelihood. So I am inflicting a cost on other people, and that is what's called an externality or a market failure. And what any economist will tell you is that the solution to this kind of a problem is to internalize the externalities, which means to change the public policy so that you don't get to pollute for free. You have to pay for the harm that you cause. So let's look at that. So we have carbon price here as a lever, as a mechanism. And what I can do is I can add a carbon price. Now, we call it a carbon price and not a carbon tax because there's a whole variety of mechanisms that you can use to price CO2. You can use a carbon tax, like they have in British Columbia, the province of British Columbia in Canada. You can use a cap and trade system where you allocate permits to all the big emitters, and then you reduce the number of permits that they get to have. You have a cap that reduces, and then they're allowed to trade those permits in case one plant can more cost effectively reduce their emissions. They can sell their permits to somebody else. Here in New England, where we live, across the entire New England seaboard, we're part of something called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and it's a cap and trade scheme for pricing CO2 emissions. The state of California has a cap and trade scheme to price CO2 emissions. But it's not just government action that can price CO2, because companies can create internal carbon prices. In fact, many companies have done exactly that. So here, this is a map of, this is a map of carbon prices around the world that of where different governments and countries and provinces and cities have imposed carbon taxes covering about 20% of global emissions. And here are the companies this is actually quite old data, I apologize for this, but back in 2013, there were already a number of companies that were creating internal prices on carbon so that when they go to build new infrastructure, they build it with their economic forecasting as if there were a $40 price on carbon. In some cases, they're actually charging that price to to facilities that are high emitting. And in fact, any time you hear of a company going carbon neutral, what that means is that they have agreed to buy carbon offsets at the level of their current emissions so that they're offsetting their emissions. And there's a lot of good debate to have about carbon offsets. I hope that we'll get to that in just a second. But the most important feature of carbon offset commitments is that you've imposed a carbon price on yourself. You've promised to pay every year the amount of money relative to that is scaled according to your emissions, and therefore you've created an incentive on yourself to reduce emissions. So what's the power of that incentive? If we were to impose a $50 price on per ton of carbon, that is roughly equivalent to a 45 cent gasoline tax. So if right now you go to the pump and it's $2 per gallon of gasoline, this is going to make it $2.45. So if I make this a $50 ton. So again, formulate your hypothesis, look at the graphs, what's going to happen when I click enter and turn on our carbon tax. Okay, so what we saw here with a $50 price on carbon, let me rewind that. I'm sorry, I'm having a funny thing where my mouse pointer is disappearing, and therefore it's a little hard for me to see. Okay. So if I undo that, we'll be able to see. And what you see is that the entire world changes under a carbon price because we're incentivizing a whole array of different changes. And we're getting out of that a 0.3 degree temperature change. So we went from, we got 1/10 of a degree difference by doing our renewable energy improvements. And then we got another 3/10 of a degree by doing this carbon price. So clearly the carbon price is a stronger action this is a stronger action. And the reason is that it is making it expensive to pollute. And that has two important effects. So if we look at these graphs, this shows us population times the economy times energy intensity times carbon intensity. That's what gives you your total emissions. When we impose a carbon price of $50, what you'll see is that you're going to see two changes. One is that our energy intensity goes down. We become more efficient in the use of our energy because it costs us more. And it disincentivizes high carbon electricity. And so we shift our attention from away from coal, oil, and gas and towards those new renewables that we just built. And so carbon pricing is a very, very efficient mechanism for trying to tackle climate change. Now, did it solve the problem? It didn't get us all the way there. Maybe the carbon price needs to be way more ambitious. If we amplify that up to more like a $100 price on carbon, then we're going to see an even stronger effect. We can get another couple tenths of a degree from that stronger price on carbon. Some might say, well, that's going to put too big of a shock on the economy, which is fine. We can just spread that out over 20 years so that we give the economy more time to adjust, and we can get ourselves to that kind of a future. So what I hope you can see here is this idea that we can explore how these different policies interact and how strong they are. Now let's look at a couple of other things that you put on your suggestions for climate actions. Um, there's a couple here that have to do with other new energy sources like nuclear, um, and so on. But there's a few here that are not related to the energy system at all that have to do with agriculture. So I see agriculture, veganism, plant-based. There's a whole set of things here around changing the way that we eat, sustainable farming, and so on. So let's explore the farming side of this, the land and agriculture side. So one mechanism that we can play with here is that so people are talking about veganism. The reason people talk about plant-based diets is because methane is a very strong greenhouse gas emission. And one important source of methane is this friendly little cow here belching methane from the enteric anaerobic fermentation that happens inside the gut of the cow. So enteric fermentation methane. So if I go for a more plant-based diet, if we move away from consuming beef, or we just get much more efficient in the way that we do that, so we reduce food waste, maybe we change the way we feed the cattle, and we create a significant decline in our agriculture and waste emissions in methane, forecast what's going to change on this picture. Nothing's going to change over here because this is just energy. What's going to change over here? How big of an impact is it going to have? Let's make a good, nice, big annual dent in our methane emissions so that we're really substantially reducing our agriculture and waste emissions. And that in itself was worth another 0.3 of a degree. So the same magnitude of change as that $50 price on carbon. So this is why people are talking a lot about agriculture right now. It's not the whole picture. It is a piece of the puzzle, but it's a critical one. And of course, methane is not the only agricultural emission. Some people said, well, we need to farm sustainably. Maybe we can even put soil into the ground by farming in ways that cause carbon to get stored under the soil. Maybe you saw the recent documentary Kiss the Ground, or Kiss the Earth, which is all about about sort of the potential of soil. Under carbon removal, we can look at different technological options we have for carbon removal, and we can go to agricultural soil carbon sequestration. So if we ramp up our farms' ability to store carbon in the soil, in fact, we get all of the farms in the world to shift to a more regenerative form of agriculture. Forecast what that's going to look like. Here we go. And what you see here is we created negative emissions. We created a carbon sink, and that got us another 0.2 of a degree. The key here is that the magnitude of that change is small relative to our total greenhouse gas emissions. So we need to think about it in tandem with all these other solutions. So what I hope you're seeing here is that is sort of the critical message of this work, is that there is no silver bullet for solving climate change, but there is silver buckshot, meaning that there is an array of solutions that together can help us to solve global climate change. If we get much more efficient in the way that we use energy, both in transportation and buildings, if we electrify, if we slow down deforestation, if we plant trees, if we do the methane reductions that we've been talking about, the renewables investments, that's what this portfolio looks like that can get us where we want to go, where we can solve this problem. But that is an all hands on deck conversation, and it's one that I hope that you will continue to challenge yourselves and MIT Sloan on as you come to be part of our extended community. Thank you all for being here. I noticed that we're at the top of the hour and I'm about to get the hook, but I hope that this has been a enriching and interesting exploration of this topic. And if you want to learn more, you can go to enroads.org to play with the tool, or you can learn more about the Sustainability Initiative at the website that we have placed here.
Thank you, Jason. That was fabulous. Thank you all for attending. As I said at the beginning of the hour, we do have our final faculty series tomorrow with Erin Kelly on gender and COVID. And so that's gonna be really interesting. So please join us for that. But Jason, this was phenomenal. So thank you all. And I hope you all are well and staying healthy and enjoying the holiday season. Take care.
Thanks for having me.